Okay, we're almost live and now we're good. Awesome. Welcome everyone to today's live expert session with employment rights attorney Menaka Fernando. We're so glad that you could join us today. We've brought this session together because navigating the workplace with any chronic illness can bring up very unique challenges. So whether you have questions about requesting accommodations, discrimination, or navigating employment law and disability, we hope that you find this session helpful. And we have Menaka with us today to answer some of our community's top questions, and I'll let you kind of tell us a little bit about yourself.
Great. Thank you, Brianna. And thank you to Lupus LA for inviting me. I'm so glad to be here. As Brianna mentioned, I am an employment rights attorney. I'm a partner at the firm Outen and Golden, based in the firm's San Francisco office. And I represent employees with a variety of issues, including disability issues, reasonable accommodation issues. And I'm also a lupus patient. I was diagnosed with lupus when I was 18, so I've been dealing and navigating all the challenges that come with a chronic illness, autoimmune disorder, for more than half my life. A lot of the issues that you have in this community is dealing with in the workplace. I've either dealt with it from a legal perspective or on a personal level. And so I'm, more than happy to be here to answer some of your questions. I thought I would get started with just some general, protections that I think everybody should be aware of when you're kind of navigating these issues in the workplace. And then we can dive into some of the questions that have already been submitted. And obviously, if there are questions that come up that I didn't answer at this session, I think that Brianna is going to provide my contact information. So you're welcome to reach out to me. So top items to know about your disability rights under the law. Number one, lupus is generally considered a disability under the law. There is really no dispute, no questioning that, even though lupus can, manifest itself in a variety of different ways. When you're having a flare, it's very likely that your major life activities are being limited in some way, and that's basically the definition of what a disability is for a disability rights kind of reasonable accommodation analysis. And even for a leave analysis, the standard is a little bit higher. You're required to have what's considered a serious health condition, and undoubtedly, if you are having a flare and your doctor is recommending that you really should be taking some time off of work, that's going to qualify. And then under kind of the disability benefits framework, right, which is a little bit different, and that's for wage replacement. It typically, if you are unable to work full time or if you're working part time or need to take complete leave and you're experiencing wage loss, then you're usually going to be eligible for disability benefits. The next thing to keep in mind is that you do not have to disclose your health condition or diagnosis to your employer. Your employer can ask you about your work restrictions, right? Because they need to know that in order to figure out if they can reasonably accommodate you. But that doesn't mean that they're entitled to know what your diagnosis is. Now, you may choose to tell them, right? Oftentimes, you do develop relationships, friendships at work and with your manager, with your colleagues, and your health condition might come up, and that's totally fine. Or in the context of asking for a reasonable accommodation, you want to disclose that information, just additional information that they have, totally fine. But they're not entitled to know that information. You have the right to a reasonable accommodation, right? If you are experiencing a flare, different symptoms, and it makes sense that you need to be on flexible work hours, you need to take time off for a medical appointment, you need ergonomic support, working from home arrangement. You need to take some time off leave, right? Leave is an accommodation. An employer is required to provide you with that reasonable accommodation unless it creates an undue burden for the employer, and that's a very kind of high threshold, right? And usually for things like flexible work schedules and time off for appointments, leave, things like that, usually those are routine requests, and unless there are exceptional circumstances for reasons why they cannot provide that, those are things that, an employer should be able to provide. Next item you should know is that you and your employer have a duty to engage in what's called a interactive process, right? So that just means that if you need an accommodation, you are obligated to tell your employer about that, give some sort of notice that you need it. And once that happens, your employer has an obligation to engage in some dialogue with you. Under the law, this is called the interactive process, for you to determine what accommodation makes sense for you, right? It's considered a two-way street. Both sides need to sit down, talk about what accommodation makes sense for you. And then you are entitled to leave rights for your serious health condition. And like I said, usually there's no question that lupus, or, if you're experiencing a flare, qualifies as a serious health condition, especially if that's what your doctor is recommending, that you take some leave. And you are entitled to 12 weeks of unpaid job protected leave. Usually, if you're working for an employer that has 5 or more employees, you have those rights under California law. And you're also entitled to leave potentially as an accommodation, which means that even beyond those 12 weeks of leave, of job protected leave that you're entitled to under the FMLA, which is the Family Medical Leave Act, or the California Family Rights Act, which is the California equivalent to the FMLA. um, your employer is still obligated to maybe extend that leave and consider that leave as an accommodation, if again, it doesn't create an undue burden. Now, for smaller employers, right, maybe this is an undue burden. But usually if you're working for a larger employer, it's highly unlikely that they can say like short extensions of leave beyond those 12 weeks are is an undue burden. Um, and then the next right that I want to highlight is kind of your right to disability benefits. Now, this is a little bit different, the framework for disability benefits, than the framework of considering kind of, do you have a right to a reasonable accommodation? Myself, I'm not a benefits lawyer. I don't practice in the world of disability benefits. And I'll try my best to kind of answer some of those questions because I did see some of those questions came up. But for our purposes, I'll just say that disability benefits are the wage replacement benefits, right? Because under FMLA, under the California Family Rights Act, you have job protection, but you don't have the right to wages. This is unpaid leave. It's not paid leave. But during that leave, if you are disabled, you can apply for disability benefits, right? And there are two ways of getting disability benefits. The first way, excuse me, is to go through the state. So that's like SDI, state disability benefits. The second way is through your company's disability benefits plan. And if you are, if you qualify with under the definition of disability under the state or under your company's disability benefits plan, then you would be entitled to wage replacement, either partial or full wage replacement, depending on which, what you apply for and what your company, specifically like with your company policy, if that's something that you need to apply for, it's advisable that you do talk to either HR or talk to like a disability benefits administrator, who might be administrating those benefits to figure out, how do I get these benefits, and how do I apply for these benefits? So those are just kind of very high level, broad strokes of things that you need to keep in mind, be aware of, rights that are important that might come up as you're navigating, working with your disability. So I will stop there, and I think Brianna's gonna kind of just go through the list of questions that the community has submitted already in advance.
Yes, thank you so much. And we know that every case is a little bit different, but hopefully we can cover some of these. I think you already touched on this first one that we received, which is, can my employer ask if, as a candidate, if I have a disability or a health issue? And I think you said no, right?
Yeah, so your employer cannot ask about your diagnosis. Like, the question, do you have a disability? That's kind of a very frowned upon question. And no employer should be asking you that question like in a hiring interview process. What they might ask, and usually it's not like in a one-on-one interview, but it's usually like in an employment application. It might ask for, do you need reasonable accommodation? Do you have work restrictions? So that's a different question. That question is perfectly acceptable. And that's a question that kind of goes to the interactive process that I was talking about. They're
Sure.
asking, like, does this employee need to put us on notice that they have some sort of work restrictions or need for accommodation, such that now, the burden shifts to the employer that we need to provide this accommodation, right? So they can ask about that. And where I see that happening is like in an application form. It's very rare where like in a, sit down one-on-one interview, somebody's asking you these questions.
Makes sense. Another question that we received is lupus commonly approved for temporary disability if you are out with a flare? And if yes, what do you need to prove to show that you're in a flare to be able to get that temporary disability?
Um, yes. So all you would need, so lupus commonly would be approved for a temporary disability. Like I said, I mean, again, each case is different, but for the most part, if and you rely a lot on your doctor for these situations because oftentimes your doctor needs to provide a doctor's note or a doctor's certification that they are recommending that you go out on leave, and that this is, you're fully disabled, that you cannot be working, and so that automatically kind of qualifies you for disability benefits. So yes, it commonly is approved for temporary disability, especially if your doctor is certifying that, which is a requirement. And like I said, what do you need to prove when you're in a flare? It's usually just that a form that a doctor will fill out. Like you fill out part of the form and then your doctor will fill out the other portion. And usually, that's all you need to be able to get the benefits.
Got it. Okay. And we also have, how long is your job protected while you're on disability in California?
So if you are on FMLA leave or California Family Rights leave, your job is protected for 12 weeks. And then outside of that, it would be considered leave as an accommodation, like under the ADA or the California equivalent, the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And that's it. Now you're in the framework of like a reasonable accommodation analysis where it's not technically job protected leave, meaning that you don't automatically have like reinstatement rights to come back to your job, but an employer is required to provide you with that leave and give you reinstatement, unless it's an undue burden on them.
Okay, interesting. And so just for clarity, that original time is paid, but then the time considered as
No.
accommodation is not paid, or all of it's not paid?
So the nothing under the law requires an employer to pay you wages for any portion of leave, unfortunately. So unless there's a company policy, and usually there are company policies. So really, it's really important to, look at your handbook about what a company's leave policy is, because oftentimes you're going to have paid leave for a portion of time pursuant to your company policy. But under the law, there is no requirement for a company to provide paid leave. So you have job protected leave under the law, and job protected just means they can't fire you during that time, unless there are exceptions to that, right? Unless unless there is like a reduction in force, layoff, or something, right? And your job would have been eliminated anyway. Then that's a defense, and that's an excuse for which that they can terminate you. But generally, during those 12 weeks, you have job protection, which means that you can't be fired, and you have reinstatement rights, which means that at the expiration of those 12 weeks, you have the right to be reinstated into your job. The paid leave comes from the disability benefits that you would apply for, either through the state or through your company's disability plan. It's usually the short-term disability plan, unless your company already provides for like a paid leave policy. I know this is all like very confusing and a lot of different things to navigate. But yeah, if you just remember what you're entitled to under the law is job protected unpaid leave. For paid leave, you either have to look to the company for a company policy that provides you with paid leave, or go to the state for state benefits, or apply for short-term disability benefits, again, through your company plan.
Okay. That makes sense. And that's a lot more um, clear. I think that's really helpful. The next question that we received here is, how far in advance do I need to request an accommodation legally? Is there like a situation where you can get in trouble for asking too late if it's a sudden need? Is there kind of a rule of thumb there, or is it case by case?
It's very much case by case. I think, um, a lot of this analysis is often very, very fact specific. So there's usually no black and white answer. Um, and specifically in this case, there's not like a legally required time period or, notice in advance that you need to provide your employer with a request for reasonable accommodation. It's just as soon as, my advice is as soon as you know you need an accommodation, that's the time you should let your employer know, right? Because it is going to take them some time to go through their process, right? Like they might have HR forms for you to fill out. They may require a doctor's note, and that's acceptable under the law. All the doctor's note, they might ask a doctor to certify what your restrictions are, and they can ask that information, not your diagnosis, but your restrictions. And that just might take some time. So it's advisable to let them know kind of as soon as you know.
Sure. And then someone asked here, is working from home on some days and not in the office every day a possible accommodation that you can request?
Yes, absolutely. I mean that, I think that that's often an accommodation, especially for immunocompromised employees that they ask for, and certainly like during the pandemic, that was, that made a lot of sense to not be in the office with a lot of people, or for any other reason that you might need to have that type of work from home arrangement, is a perfect example of an accommodation that you can request and is routinely granted, right? There is the question that comes up of whether like being in the office 5 days a week or 4 days a week or whatever your employer's requiring, and like, the back to office mandates that are happening with a lot of companies, is whether being in the office is an essential function of your job, right? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't, and oftentimes it's a question of like, what are your job responsibilities, right? Do you have to have in-person interactions with customers, client? Is there a reason, do you need to have, do you need to be on site for different things? Are you retail? So there might be situations where you being in person is actually an essential function of your job. And then, maybe working from home for that job doesn't make sense, but that's not where the conversation stops, right? Then your employer is obligated to look for, okay, well, in this position, they can't do a remote work, but are there other positions or alternate positions that, we can put you in where temporarily at least you can be working remotely so that they can be accommodating you, right? So it's always this kind of discussion that needs to be happening about what accommodations are possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like the more that you're sharing with us, it seems like the cases are so specific based on the company and the situation. And we had somebody actually ask if I have a social work retreat with a large amount of people and I'm very immune compromised, do I legally have to go or can I request an accommodation? Is this something that you see being like commonly accepted since it's not an essential, maybe doesn't fall under that essential
Yeah.
work function?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine a scenario where a work retreat is an essential function of somebody's job. So I can't imagine any reason or any justification that an employer can come up with that like that type of exemption couldn't be provided. Maybe you suggest like, is there a way for me to attend virtually, right? And I'm happy to do that. And sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't, because the whole virtual attendance also requires the technology and maybe they're, I don't know, camping or whatever. And that's not possible. But yeah, I can't imagine a scenario where that couldn't be a exemption or an accommodation provided for somebody with that's immunocompromised.
That's relieving to hear. The next question is about having your accommodation rejected. So, if a reasonable accommodation is rejected by your company, is there a reason why that would be denied, or is there anything that you can do if that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, again, this is very fact specific, right? And the question to ask is, well, why? Why is it being denied? Is it because, um, this is an essential function of my job that I do this thing, whatever the doctor is saying I shouldn't do? Um, or is it because the company is saying that this is causing them an undue burden? For example, like, okay, you've been on 12 weeks of leave, and your doctor, thinks that you need additional 3 months of leave, 6 months of leave, and the company comes back and says, we can't provide that amount of leave. We're a small restaurant. We don't have the ability or, the resources to cover that amount of time of you being gone. You need to come back by X date, or you might be fired, kind of thing, right? So it's important to understand why exactly the company is saying that your accommodation request is being denied. And again, that's not where the conversations should stop, right? They should come back with, well, we can't provide you with that, exactly what you're asking for, but here's what we can provide you with. And then, you can take a look at that and say, does that make sense? You can talk to your doctor about that. Does that work with my restrictions? And then maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, then you come back and say, okay, well, I still can't do this thing that you're telling me to do because my doctor is saying that I can't do that. Can we come up with some other accommodation here? And so that's how it kind of becomes a conversation. It's usually not sufficient for a company just to like consider your request and say no. They're obligated to affirmatively say, okay, if you're saying no, here's what we can provide.
Makes sense. We have another question here that just got submitted. I'm not sure if this is too specific of a case. to comment on, but we just got one that says, what if your health care through your is through your union and they're challenging your disability during the time in which you had to qualify for health care because you are not disabled right now, even though you just had a kidney transplant? Um, Basically, the user's asking if you got a transplant during the time to qualify for health care, but are now on like disability through a union. I don't know if that's something that we can address here. Maybe we direct that person to our inbox.
Yeah, I think I think I would need to know a little bit more about the situation
Yeah, it's pretty
order to.
specific. We'll contact that community member and give them our email address to chat more about that one.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I'm seeing what else. What if I need partial disability? Can you work some hours on disability?
Yes, generally, yes. You can. So the way that, my understanding of how disability benefits work is, they're looking at not necessarily how many hours you're working. It's the question of what is your wage loss, right? And if there is like a threshold wage loss that you meet, then you would be entitled to either partial or full disability benefits. And again, I'm not an expert in disability benefits, but I think you can find those thresholds. Like if you go to the EDD, California EDD website for state disability benefits, or through your company's short-term disability plan, or, reaching out to HR, reaching out to like your benefits provider.
Okay. We just had another question. Somebody just asked based on your comment about like the specificity of like going back and forth
Mhm.
and having that dialogue. Someone asked, in this interactive process, I've seen employers ask for more specificity constantly. So, quote, flexible schedule is not approved in specific timeframes, which are not always as flexible as a person may need to get approved. Any suggestions for getting that language right? It sounds like they're not able to get specific like timing approved. Um,
Yeah. I mean, at a certain point, this is why I have a job, right?
yeah.
It might make sense to get some legal advice and legal consultation if an employer is just, not being reasonable in the process, or you're just getting a lot of pushback on the accommodations that you need. And certainly your doctor's recommending one thing and it's just not workable. Because the analysis here is your employer obligated to give you what you want is very fact specific. It does make sense, to potentially consult with a lawyer, right? Because obviously, I see this over and over again where employers are not doing what they're supposed to be doing with respect to providing accommodation and engaging in the interactive process. So at a certain point, if you're just facing obstacle after obstacle, I think it's advisable just to get some advice from a lawyer.
Okay, makes sense. I think that's all of our questions. I think we might have one more. Last question here. What questions are asked on disability review? I don't know if this is in the context of like asking the state. I don't know if that's the right area.
Hmm. I think that's right. I think disability reviews are usually if you've been getting disability benefits through the state for like a very long period of time. Usually, they do like a disability review just to have an understanding of whether you still need benefits or whether like you've improved sufficiently such that you can go back to work and no longer in need of wage replacement. But I've never gone through the process and actually, and don't have like in the legal um perspective on it because that's not the area of law that I practice in. So I don't know like what the specific questions are that they ask. My assumption is if you can get further doctor certification that you still need to be on disability, that you can't work either full-time, part-time, that you should be entitled to benefits, until like whatever the cap is.
Sure. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you so much for weighing in on all of these questions. We really appreciate your time so much, especially coming at it from, the patient angle yourself and from your expertise as a professional. It's so awesome to be able to kind of get your thoughts on these questions that keep popping up in the community. So for everyone listening, I'll link to Menaka's profile and company in case you want to contact her or you have any other questions. And then, of course, if you have any case specific or lupus specific questions for us, you can always email our team at info@lupusla.org and we'll connect you with our virtual care coordinator to kind of help figure out what resources you might need or how we can support you in a specific situation. And we'll link that in the comments below the video as well. So thank you so much for your time,
Thank you.
Menaka.
Thank you so much for having me.